this concept of a CFO as also basically being the chief data officer of the company. We deliver something that becomes a key part of their team the minute they sign us up. The audience is different between a company that's got professional investors in it and one that's family and founder owned. On the family and founder owned side, you have other considerations like personal tax is tied in with the profitability of the business. And you want to really give them ideas about how to operate the business more efficiently so that it's more profitable, but then also be able to help them understand how to better manage their tax situation. You as an executive, you should have a real strategic finance person who's been around the block, helping you think through your business, your story, your next set of decisions that you're making. Also help you reflect on all the things that are not going well in your business. It's lonely being a CEO. The peace of mind and insight alone is worth a lot of money.
Thank you for joining us today. You've had a pretty successful run in PE, VC, and as a CFO. What inspired you to start CFO Pro+Analytics?
I kind of went through a journey and an arc of experience where I was dealing with investing, buying and selling companies as a growth equity investor, and then became an operating CFO, as an executive. And, those two things are really related in that a lot of times as a growth equity investor, one of your main points of contact is a CFO. And when I became an operator, I reimagined what the role would be in terms of being extremely effective to help achieve the objectives of investors, which is, really the perspective of growth equity investors. And so I took a lot of the know-how from creating value as an investor and then combining it with my own view of like technical financial work that's also highly strategic and adds value to the whole executive team. And as a result of that, I evolved this CFO concept of the CFO as also basically being the chief data officer of the company. All data flowing through finance, single source of truth, get the whole team aligned around priorities that are grounded in real facts that can be connected to financial results. And through that whole experience, when I wrapped that up and decided what I was going to do next, I realized I could actually package all that know-how into a bite-sized service offering and bring that what I would call, private equity grade capability to businesses that, would never really be able to take advantage of this type of capability. And I could package it into a pricing structure where we deliver all of the value without the overhead. And so it becomes very cost effective compared to building out your own team. So for businesses that are, call it between $3 and $100 million of revenue, we've got a permanent part-time solution that gives them all of the value, as I said, without the overhead.
Nice.
And they're getting to work with people that typically in those types of businesses, especially if you're family or founder owned, you may not have access to the level of professional and academic training and skill that our team has, because they're usually either working at much bigger
Right,
organizations,
companies.
or they're working in private equity or in venture-backed companies tend to get some of these people. So we deliver something that becomes, I would say, a key part of their team the minute that they sign us up.
That's great. That's such a shot in the arm for these small to medium sized businesses. I spoke to another gentleman in operations that does something similar. He used to work for Apple and some of these larger corporations, and now he's Bain and McKinsey and stuff, and now he's offering that to small and medium sized businesses, similar to what you're doing with the CFO work. Now you have a pretty broad kind of experience with high growth startups as well as family owned businesses. How does your philosophy shift or stay consistent across these vastly different arenas?
Um, you know, the the audience is different between a company that's got professional investors in it and one that's family and founder owned. And so and I mean audience in terms of like not that I'm performing for somebody like in a show format, but in terms of deliverables, they've got an appetite for certain type of content that is more meaningful to them. And so the investor led companies or the companies that have professional investors in them, you know, there's probably more sophisticated reporting, um, you know, really sometimes also focusing in on a level of detail that in the day to day is not quite as meaningful as they might think it is, but it's important to them. And so you need to be able to accommodate them and also educate them on what some of the more important drivers are. Um, I've talked to, I've heard the story, more than a handful of times where somebody raises private equity money and they've got a young associate in the private equity firm who's like just out of business school, has never really operated a business, understands value creation, how to build financial models, and they just pestering the finance department for a lot of stuff that really is not that important. And I think there's a little bit of an education process that you need to go through there, especially when you're trying to execute and operate on the business. On the family and founder owned side, you have other considerations like personal tax is tied in with the profitability of the business. And you want to really give them ideas about how to operate the business more efficiently so that it's more profitable, but then also be able to help them understand how to better manage their tax situation. There, I've got two clients that this happened to where they all of a sudden, this is before we got involved, made a lot more money than they expected, and they hadn't planned for the taxes. They had consumed that working capital for future growth, and now all of a sudden the tax man shows up and is like, "Hey, where's my envelope?" And then all of a sudden they are in like going from being a business that's fairly well run and has a good flywheel turning to one that now the flywheel is kind of has to slow down because they've got a cash crunch. So you've got issues like that you might face in a family and founder-owned business. I think the other thing with the family and founder-owned business is they know in their gut the mechanics of like what's making the business turn on itself and act and be profitable. But what you do is you basically shine a real light on it and show them like with a higher degree of precision, like here are the drivers, here's what happened last month. This is why it's not as good as you thought it was, or this is why it's better than you thought it was. And you give them, more metrics that matter, that they can kind of react to. And it's fun working with them too, because if they're really involved in the business, they intuitively know the different mechanics, and then you're showing it to them in black and white, and a lot more light bulbs go off for them, and they really start to think about the implications of what you're showing them and how they can better operate their business.
So I want to circle back to you said about having a single source of truth that the finance or the CFO essentially becomes the head of data for the company, and it all goes through that space. What are some of the pitfalls of not doing that? So if data is all over the place, what's
Oh,
the problem, I guess?
yeah, I'll give a sort of a classic example. You walk into a meeting and the head of sales says, you know, my customer acquisition cost is X and it's based on this commission data that he pulled directly from his commission sheets, which feed payroll. And then the finance person walks in and says, no, the customer acquisition costs are actually this. And the reason that yours is wrong is that our commission schedule is paid out, let's say, over time. And you're factoring in a lot of commissions that are being paid on older deals, and your time frames are messed up, or your maybe the product mix changed and now the pricing is different, and so you're applying commissions to a product set that now is no longer directly tied to the payouts that you're calculating. That would be like a classic example that might resonate with some people in the audience, because you've got two credible sources of information, right? You can't dispute the payroll, but it's really how you apply it. And actually, those two things can actually be matched together so that you can explain how one gets to the other. But the sales person who's running the sales team is usually not doesn't have the kind of the global awareness to really understand how to tie it back. And the finance person might be coming in with a different set of data, and then you have this conversation that's kind of going like this, where they're just talking past each other. They're both right. One in my opinion is, if the finance people have the right data, they are actually correct in probably how they're doing it. But you can spin a lot of cycles and waste a lot of time disagreeing about stuff that is really just a mismatch. It's not like one is wrong. It's just not matched correctly to the analysis that you're trying to do. Um, another thing that could come up is, if you're running an inventory based business on QuickBooks and it's using like an average cost based structure, you can walk into a meeting and you're pulling data out of the accounting system and it's telling you, hey, these chairs that we sold have a gross margin of X. Now all of a sudden you have a new container that came in of the same exact chairs, subject to a 30% or 34% tariff from China. And someone who's not really thinking about it is going to rely on the average cost data, think that the new inventory got put into the system and is now updating the cost, but is actually using a very long window of cost. Whereas, I sold out of all the old chairs and the next batch of chairs are going to be at the marginal rate that includes a 34% tariff. And you can make bad pricing decisions based on that. And it's all based on the fact that, QuickBooks uses this average cost inventory costing system where, preferably you would do it first in, first out of inventory, and always be applying the exact margin based on what the product actually cost you when you brought it into inventory. I hope I'm not getting too technical, but
No, and
those
it
are
basically just sounds like there would be a lot more room for disagreement, confusion, bad decisions made
100%.
if
Yeah.
data is coming from different places and taken from different
Yeah.
places.
The confusion and disagreement you can deal with. The bad decisions you can't deal with. But by the way, those are all real examples. Like, I mean, I can't name names, but those are real situations.
You've raised $500 million, scaled a company's revenue from 38 to $198 million, and led 12 M&A exits. What's one deal or transformation that really tested you?
I had a deal that I did. It was the only public company transaction I was involved in. And it was in a great space. It was a business that was powering streaming media um, across many different platforms as sort of an infrastructure provider. And, this is all things related to, not, think of YouTube related content that is not on YouTube, but is being used by businesses for their own purposes, or individuals creating their own, content and, live streams, whatever as the case may be. Um, that was an interesting situation where there was, the company was founded by uh, a team that was able to tap into the public markets to raise capital at a very, very small, for a very, very small size business relative to what you would expect. And, they bootstrapped the whole thing, and they did a really, really good job. Um, and we sort of ran into the situation where we had outgrown the business had kind of outgrown the CEO, and there was a lot of challenges in terms of trust between the CEO and the board. Um, and we had to make a change, and really on our way to planning for an exit, which was really ultimately to sell the company to a much larger publicly traded company. And the big challenges there were that they had a pretty solid team. Um, the the outgoing CEO, who this was kind of his baby, just had a lot of issues, relinquishing the position. Um, and it was, uh, I think the thing that was the biggest learning on that was that we actually had a lot of outside board members involved in that deal who were more neutral to the situation and kind of the objective observers. And they really had to do quite a bit of work to, make the transition smooth and just deal with, the personal repercussions of this big change in this CEO's life.
Mm-hmm.
I think coming from the investors, we wouldn't have been successful with that transition, because and I can't argue with his point of view that, we obviously had other motives, even though we were on the board, in terms of, like, seeing this business increase in value, but perhaps not in the same way that he viewed it. And so the outside board members were pretty instrumental in, helping to navigate those big changes in the organization. Um, and ultimately, the business continued to do well, and it grew, and we did end up selling it to a larger public company. So the plan worked out. I think ultimately the CEO, he had a lot of stock in the business, and I didn't actually speak to him at all after that happened, but I'm imagining that he was probably pretty happy with the outcome.
Well, talking to a successful numbers guy, I suppose it shouldn't be surprising that the challenging thing was personal dynamics. And I work with a executive coach, and I also was bringing some challenges that I was facing with team dynamics to him. And he said, David, you're like doing the hardest thing in the world, which is working with other human beings. And it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. It's like it's everything in that, different perspectives, different dynamics. And the person taking a company from 0 to 1 might not be the same person taking it from 1 to 100, or at least not the way that, obviously having a board empowers you in so many ways, different perspectives and networks and abilities. But then at the same time, you're going to have different realities and different incentives and different deductions from certain data coming in. And so, and that scales as you're going to a, 7-figure company to 8-figure and beyond. So
Right.
yeah, that's it's impressive that you were able to successfully land that plane. Congratulations.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm very grateful to the outside board members who, as I said, were pretty important. And I think the other thing I would say is that the investors in that type of a situation might, if they're not intuitive about the people dynamics, they may choose to flex in that situation, and that would be the exact wrong thing to do. right? The right thing to do is like to figure out like, you know, this is an issue right now. It can probably be a temporary issue if we handle it correctly. And that's really not the time to flex, right? It's the time to like see who else is around the table and leverage the resources that you have.
That's a wise statement. That I mean, your resume speaks for itself. I mean, it flexes all on its own. Now, I'd like to ask you a bit about balancing growth with quality, because maintaining quality as you're maximizing for growth is a challenging balance to strike. How did you learn to scale your own consulting business without compromising the caliber of your services?
Um, Two main things. One is I have a methodology that um, at some point I'm going to probably need to put into like a formal sort of training system. But I make sure that anybody that I bring on, understands the methodology and kind of, you know, how we deliver value. And the second is I leverage my network for really good talent. And I think I'm fortunate that I have a good network, but also fortunate that um, there's a lot of people who are, 20 years of experience who really are looking for permanent part-time work. They want to have more control over their schedule. They realize that, the COVID economy with, video communications has opened up their ability to work more flexibly and they want to take advantage of that. And as a result, there's, good talent that really wants to be involved with a couple of different companies, maybe three, have a little bit of variety, have control over their schedule, and also be working directly with the decision makers. So I have something really nice to offer people, which means I can attract, I think, good talent. Um, and then I really just at least in this first year and a half or so that I've been running the business, I've been relying mainly on my own network. Some people who've worked for me in the past, some who haven't, but um, come highly recommended. And then I've got a trusted set of people on my existing team who helped me with interviewing and making sure that people that we're choosing to work with are the right fit.
So coming back to people versus numbers, or people and numbers, maybe not versus, it's an interesting kind of dichotomy in a way, because it makes sense that in the world of finance, we want to make decisions that are based on reality, it's based on data, it's based on something that's more objective. But to David's point earlier about humans, is that humans are not objective. They do not make decisions based on data most of the time. We're more fluid and kind of emotional creatures. And I wonder that there's an example I was thinking of. Do you know who Rory Sutherland is, Sal?
I don't know.
Okay, he's a British guy, and he talks a lot, and he goes on podcasts a lot, like Chris Williamson type podcast, where he talks about marketing. And he, being a marketing guy, he's maybe not always the best fan of the finance side of things because he sees it as odds. And he gives an example of, if you take a hotel that has a doorman, a finance person might look at that and say, what are we paying for? Right? That's a line against the budget that is paying for somebody to open the door. But the intangible of that, the human feeling around that, is maybe more security. It's maybe that you get less types of behavior that happen outside the hotel, that it gives a status thing. They're all things you can't quantify, but that will affect the way your customers see you. How do you balance the tangible data in your mind with the intangible human reality of hiring, customers, all of that stuff?
Yeah, so what I think is an important characteristic in the folks that work on my team are they're good communicators and they have the ability to really understand the bigger picture. And I think that's a really good example about the cost of the doorman versus the experience that you're trying to provide. And I think that, um, when Rory Sutherland uses that as an example, that becomes a trap with finance. He's not working with a finance team that is really trying to understand the overall product and mission of the business. Now, that could be because there's a disagreement about the overall value and the mission of the business, because, marketing could be out here thinking that this is our vision, and the finance team is listening to the CEO who's over here saying, oh, that's really not my vision. Or another example could be like, hey, we have working capital issues and we need to figure out how to cut costs. And there's like a miscommunication. And so the marketing people are feeling like finance guy is just coming here trying to shut down the user experience. And there's no conversation about, oh, the reason I'm asking you those questions is because we've got to figure out a way to like reduce costs. And that's where the communication piece becomes really important, right? And I'm a big believer in just full transparency.
Hmm.
I think that, you shouldn't be afraid of how people are gonna react to bad news or changes.
Hmm.
We can get into like another founders slash CEO issue, which is like whipsawing an organization with like shifting priorities. Let's set that aside for a second because that does happen as well. But if you have consistency in your messaging and you're transparent, I think you end up having a much more a stronger basis for cohesive conversation, so that the conversation about the doorman and the user experience is not detached from what the financial goals are. These people are actually having a conversation about, we're running a high-end hotel and you need to have the personal touch of the doorman.
Hmm.
And the finance person is saying, yeah, I understand that. And we need to like figure out where else we're going to cut costs, or how we're going to change the way that we do it so that we can try to identify these areas for margin improvement so that we can run the business more efficiently. It's they've got to talk, and if you have too junior of a finance person or one that's just clocking in,
Hmm.
or and they don't care as much as the marketing people do about the experience,
Hmm.
um, that could be another cause of sort of the mismatch of the conversation. But
Yeah.
ultimately, you can be very aligned, right? And so I think having effective communicators who really think about the whole business and not
Hmm.
just their area is the way to do that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think the understanding why, because I guess sometimes I'm being very broad here, but let's say marketing might be seen as more creative and finance is seen as more rule based. I don't think that's necessarily true, but let's just assume that. But if marketing are told you now can't do this or you now can't do that because finance says, but there's no communication about why or what brought us to this decision or what were the factors that we had to consider, people just see it as I'm being told a rule, right? I'm being told by the
Right.
person that sets the rules that I just can or can't do something. Another example here, and I wonder what you think here. Another Rory Sutherland talked about the probably billions, probably of pounds that goes into extending train tracks or making trains quicker or something like that, so that you make an hour journey 45 minutes, but that costs
Hmm.
so much and all of the infrastructure that it costs. And he said for the same amount of money you could hire the world's top supermodels and buy the best champagne and have them walk up and down the train serving people champagne, and they'd want the journey to be longer. So I wonder if it comes down to just logical decisions or maybe creative ones. To what degree would you say there's this might not make logical sense, but I can see from a human perspective that this would be worth our investment, because humans are illogical, is my point.
Yeah, I think the that's a really good edge case to
Mm.
really draw a distinction, but there's a lot of truth in that in terms of other places where it might apply. Um, and again, I think that a decision like that would be at the highest levels of an organization. And it could be a small organization or it could be a giant one, but let's just say, it's really CEO, head of marketing, head of finance, those three people in a room. You could say head of product, or user experience, whatever it is. You probably, if you're really going to consider hiring supermodels, you probably want to have the head of HR in there, but you're for probably more than one reason. But you, if those people are communicating at that level, they should be able to bat around the concept of like, I'm optimizing for speed of transport or I'm optimizing for the user experience,
Yeah.
and then they need to make a decision about which way they're going to go. Either one could work and they both can make money. But what are they optimizing for? And is that aligned with their mission and the overall vision of the business, right? You could imagine like, if you compared like Ryanair to Virgin, Ryanair is more of on the along the lines of I need to turn these planes.
Mm-hmm.
Speed is important, whereas Virgin might be more like, I want to have good looking flight attendants.
Ice
What?
cream.
Yeah, and when the plane lands, 30 minutes late, no one really cares. You know what I mean?
Mm.
That would be those are two totally different order. Now, if if the head of product walked into a Ryanair executive meeting and said, "Oh, we should do this," which is like, have supermodels and serve ice cream and do all this. I mean, you just wouldn't be able to have that. Would be like somebody just like totally walking in cold off the street, not knowing anything about the business, proposing, because obviously you need to do a huge shift to the business model to even be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit of context, I think, that
Mm-hmm.
matters too about the situation that you're in.
Yeah.
And I think the example that he draws with the train metaphor is true as an edge case, but you might not ever be forced to like make that stark of a decision because the business that you're talking about is already going to be in a certain category where one kind of makes more sense.
Yeah. And like you said, aligns more with what their longer term mission is anyway, as an
Exactly,
overall.
exactly, exactly. I think if you were just doing like a startup and we were just saying like, I mean, starting up a train company wouldn't be a good example, but you could talk about a startup airline and it was just the three of us and we had Rory in there, he can make his case for supermodels, and flying into, more congested airports and charging a premium, and someone else can make the argument for more of a Ryanair model, and then you can debate like which kind of business do we want to build,
Proof is in the bottom line and the reviews.
yeah.
Many startups neglect finance until they need a deck for investors. What does due diligence really look like in that case?
If you're it depends on the stage of the business and like what round of financing you're trying to raise. um Obviously in the very early stages where you're looking at series A type investing, the decks really more are marketing materials and convincing the investor group that this leadership team is going after, a really important market opportunity. I think the more mature the business gets, the more important the details are that are in the deck. And when I say deck, I mean like you have one source of information that's generating a deck for conversation, but it's directly tied to a very detailed deck that I would call an information memorandum that provides way more volume of information that is aligned exactly with the conversational deck that you've created. And building that detailed piece of work, body of work, is critical for being able to have the conversation, because you want to have one consistent story. And the story is the thing that I try to, um, in order to make the process um, interesting, useful, end up with a good work product, and to engage as many people who need to be involved as possible. I always try to bring people back to, when you're dealing with the deck and preparing for due diligence, what's the story we're trying to tell,
Mhm.
and what are the fundamental components of that story. And if they haven't done it before and they're a pretty mature business, that takes a while. It's not, because whatever story you're trying to tell, you got to make sure that it's really backed up with good information,
Mhm.
and that in any meeting with a prospective investor, you can pull out the details and illustrate the key aspects of what you're telling them with real information. And that's takes time. It's
And
not
when
something you can do overnight.
understandable. When you say a consistent story, I think it's worth underscoring that doesn't mean necessarily the same business model or the same variables, as long as there's a throughput as to why. So if you look at Amazon, that started with a bookstore, now they're doing automation, AWS, robotics, e-commerce, and there's a throughput there where it made sense to start with books and the storytelling aspect and connecting to people. But what would you say as far as like what you mean when you say making sure there's a consistency?
What I mean is that there's 100% agreement on the leadership team with the message that we're trying to convey, and that everyone believes the data that supports that message. Um, and it's consistent for everybody. There's no alternative view. You can talk about optionality, like, hey, we're going in with this story, but to this investor, this aspect is more important because it's related to these different options, and you can kind of prepare for that. But ultimately, it's all based off of like a core belief of what it is that you're selling as an investment. And that's the consistency you want. You don't want to have disagreement around that core message, and why it's important, how you can prove it out with good information. Um, how do you get you ensure that the whole team is bought into that? Those are the types of things that I mean when I say consistency.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying or expanding on that. If you could wave a magic wand and fix one common finance mistake across the startup world, what would that be?
That's a great question. What would I fix? I can give you two answers to that. One is extremely tactical, which is however you do it, get some advice, call us up for some advice. We don't need to take you on as a client. Um, think through your chart of accounts in the accounting system. And for God's sake, do not pick some accounting system that no one's heard of. Just, you know, go to QuickBooks. I know there's some other really cool ones that are out there. Um, you know, QuickBooks has tons of people that know how to use it, and it's got a great ecosystem of add-ons, and it's integrated with all these other great technologies. Um, but once you get that accounting system picked, think through your chart of accounts so that you make it extensible and accurate for the business as you see it, and that it can be easily connected to financial reporting in a way that makes sense. And that's easier said than done, especially if you're not a finance person and you're like, I need to hire a bookkeeper. And then you just go and hire a bookkeeper and you just end up with a chart of accounts that the bookkeeper invents. The bookkeeper is not going to ask you like 10 major questions that are probably pretty easy to answer that are going to define the chart of accounts in one fell swoop from the get-go. That would be one thing. The second thing I would say is don't view finance as a cost center. And I'm not saying that as a self-serving piece of information. You as an executive running a startup, whether you use it as in an advisory capacity on a very limited basis, but you should have a real strategic finance person who's been around the block helping you think through your business, your story, your next set of decisions that you're making, and also help you reflect on all the things that are not going well in your business, why they're happening, how you could change them. These are all things that have massive payback. And it's lonely being a CEO, right? And so having a trusted person who's got your back, who's going to give you unvarnished truth and tell you when they think you're wrong, help you refine the things that you think are right, that pays back all the time. You don't need to count. You don't need to count it. Just the peace of mind and insight alone that you get from that is worth a lot of money. And I find that a lot of startups, venture-backed businesses with first-time CEOs really have many of them don't really have an appreciation for that. And they might also have a terrible chart of accounts. So
So moving on to you kind of more personally. So understanding is you're multilingual, global experience, you're an author. How do you bring all of those different elements of yourself to your work as a CFO and advisor?
how do I do it? Sometimes I on the more humorous side, I might be in a situation where somebody has no idea that I speak Italian or Spanish, and I'll just say to them, "Oh, do you want to watch me speak Spanish?" And then they're like, "What are you talking about?" And then I'll just start talking to somebody, and they'll be like, "Oh, that's a neat trick. I didn't know you could do didn't know you could do that." But I you know the the global stuff and like my background as still child of immigrants, I think um, is more so just like a work ethic and uh, a broad view of kind of like understanding people that are in front of me. Um, so that really helps just in terms of being able to be direct but sensitive. Can't say that I'm like that. I've been that way 100% of 100% of the time in my whole life, but it's an important skill to continually practice because people need to get feedback. I need to get feedback and not, you know, shrink away from it. Um, but it helps with the interpersonal kind of conversations that you want to have with people to lay things out for them, especially in a way that they can understand and can maybe do something with it. Um, I think that the work ethic piece and sort of like the real interest and curiosity, um, comes out of just having been involved in a lot of like diverse situations, different cultures and businesses over the years. Um, I think that makes me pretty flexible in terms of dealing with changing dynamics. Don't get me wrong, it's like not easy to, pivot and shift. It's hard, but
Mm.
um, I think if you've seen it before, or you've been in situations where you see how different people are able to navigate environments, it makes you more willing to try to work it out as the obstacles start, getting thrown in front of you.
Mhm.
I mean, I would say those are really the two or three, I don't know how many examples I gave, but ways that I kind of go about that. Uh, I one thing, like growing up in Brooklyn, in a blue collar neighborhood where, you know, a lot of people were looking to navigate their lives and find new opportunities, either through education or just, going directly into the workforce. Um, you know, you see a lot of different success stories and different ways that people have kind of made their way. Um, and it just gives you a lot of, I think, insight into what's possible. You know, I would
Mhm.
say, you know, um, growing up in an area like that, there's a lot of people trying to do something new and different and better for themselves, and actually doing it, you know, under much more challenging circumstances, I would argue, than what people might face today.
Mhm.
Like technology enablement, is on a totally different level these days. So you really, you, as I reflect upon that, I really think about, how that just informs, the kind of get it done sort of attitude, and you can really kind of navigate through all these issues. It's not as bad as it looks. Sometimes it is as bad as it looks, but most of the time it's probably not.
Yeah, a bit more of that push and drive and resilience.
Yeah, yeah.
I
And the
think
magic trick of speaking a language when people
And
don't even
language.
use it. I get that. I'm sure you do as well, actually, David, because I speak Spanish because my wife is
Right,
Mexican and I don't look like I do. So
right.
that could sometimes come in really handy.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sure, David, you probably have the same in Japanese, I would
I had a
guess.
gentleman. So I was a tour guide, Sal, in Japan, and I had a gentleman from LA, a lawyer, and I was doing some translation. And the look he gave me was just like classic. And I said, "It looks like a monkey, like doing tricks, doesn't it?" And he's like, "Yeah, it's amazing. Like the sounds you're making with your face, like." But it's like, yeah, I get it. We're tribal, and you don't expect someone to do something like that.
Yeah.
It's unexpected.
In New York, I've had more than once the eavesdropping on the elevator conversation
Uh-huh.
in Spanish around me, hearing, or being in a hotel,
Yeah.
or something like that, and somebody complaining about something, and you're just sort of laughing to yourself because they might be saying something that is actually true, and you're like, wow, they saw what I saw. Um, but it also reminds me, uh, David, of your example of in my YouTube feed. This hasn't happened in a while, but for a period of time, I kept getting the Caucasian guy in New York
I
City
saw that speaking like
who
fluent Chinese in
Chinese,
Chinatown.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, in Chinatown, and
Yeah.
walking around and just like completely like stopping the scene
I
where
love
they're just,
that. Maybe
you
I'm
know,
I'm simple-minded, but I love that whole like non sequitur, unexpected like connection.
it's
Because in the
pretty,
end,
it's pretty
sorry, go ahead.
funny. Yeah. No, no, I agree. It is like ultimately there's like a real connection there between the people, and they really appreciate this person.
Mhm.
Because
They're
you're communicating so much with so little. by
little,
by
right,
speaking that language, you're demonstrating kind of like there's a comedian, Andrew Schultz, also from New York, I believe, and one of his like trademark or signature kind of features is he'll do like 5 or 10 minutes of crowd work wherever he's going, be it India or Dubai or wherever, and he'll have like such unique like specific knowledge about their culture in the humor that's like kind of poking fun at them, but there's only someone that truly understands them would be able to like get that. So it's kind of
right.
endearing at the same time, and they love him for it.
Yeah, it makes total sense.
So I think this is kind of timely, given you mentioned the COVID economy and all sorts of shifts happening right now, tectonic in scale. You have degrees from Wharton, Penn Engineering, and Harvard, but you've also stayed sharp in the jungle of the real world. What skill set matters most today, institutional pedigree or execution intelligence? And I know it's kind of a trick question, but
Mhm.
how would you kind of
Oh, I would
address that?
say definitely execution intelligence. That comes in all forms. I think, educational pedigree sort of opens up certain doors for you. But I would say having the ability to, execute, get things done in an intelligent way is, a life learning experience. And, um, once you've, gone into a certain path, yeah, you can maybe have more optionality to you depending on like educational pedigree that sort of wears off at, through a certain stage of your career. But um, being able to execute and get things done is highly prized anywhere. I think what's challenging about that though is if you're a person who has that mentality, you could end up in like a career obstacle in some ways because you could end up in a kind of a dysfunctional organization where the desire to be execution oriented is not a priority, and you need to pivot out of that organization as quickly as possible, because if you really know that you're a get it done kind of person, you've got to avoid the political slash you know personally object uh, personality driven environments that are not going to be able to allow you to do your best work.
Great point. Where can listeners or viewers learn about your work, your framework, and perhaps even hire you?
Yeah, the best place is on our website. It's CFOProAnalytics.com. There's a lot of, you know, blog posts there about working with a CFO, different types of problems and challenges. There's some case studies on there. There's a really good set of calculators on there that you can use as an entrepreneur or family owner to like evaluate different types of financial decisions that you may be making or are thinking about making. So there's a lot of good information there. Definitely visit. And if you're interested in having a chat, absolutely, you can get in touch right through the website there. There's a calendar link. You can book 20 minutes of my time or someone on my team's time and have a quick conversation.
Thanks for chatting with us today. It was really interesting getting your insight into like business at different scales. Is there anything you want to leave us with? Anything we didn't touch on that you'd like to highlight?
Um, I think the last point was a really good one. I think, to people in your audience, if you're a get it done kind of person and you're constructive, you're a really good communicator, don't get stuck in an organization where that's not valued and leveraged. Um, try to get into an organization where you can really put those skills to really good use, because they really are, I think, the most valuable skills um, for success, and you want to use them and practice them as much as possible.
Noted. Well, thank you, Sal. Pleasure.
Thank you.